Are we going to see a direct economic impact from the Panama paper leaks? Probably not, but there is a small probability of some secondary effects. Kallum Pickering, Berenberg Bank. So Janet Yellen brushed aside criticism that the Federal Reserve's December rate hike was a mistake and instead argued that the US economy has made tremendous progress. How do you assess the Fed's rate path of late?
The US Federal Reserve has become more dovish of late. That's probably owing more to the volatility in financial markets since the start of the year than it is US economic conditions. Now, remember that the US Federal Reserve is the most important central bank in the world, and the dollar is the de facto reserve currency for the world. So if you get these periods of financial volatility and the Fed does something that leads to an appreciation in the dollar, that can really exacerbate those problems. So the Fed was cautious not to do that. It's the reason they've become more dovish. The US economy actually looks pretty good. Domestic demand looks to be picking up nicely and should do for the rest of the year despite global headwinds. So what we might see is some reversal in the language from the Fed heading into the middle of the year, and it's probably likely that so long as the financial market volatility passes, we might get a hike again mid-summer and probably a second hike towards the end of the year, probably in Q4.
Okay, well, the WTO have projected that the global economy is set to see its fifth consecutive year of subpar growth in international trade this year, marking its worst period since the 1980s. With the IMF widely expected to downgrade its 3.4% global growth forecast next week as well, how would you describe global economic sentiment?
Global sentiment remains subdued. I would say that certainly in the developed world, the risks outweigh the reality. The underlying concerns that markets, say, had from the end of last year heading into this year, so, the low commodity prices in the low oil prices, potential questions over the health of the US economy, slow down in China, whether or not central banks like the ECB, the Bank of Japan, can actually get their economies back on track. Do they have enough monetary ammunition left? Those sorts of questions which were driving the volatility and the question marks over the global economy at the beginning of the year, the volume on those risks has come down significantly since February. So whilst I wouldn't say sentiment's on a positive footing, it's improved relative to where it was, say, a few months ago. The two key risks which are playing out at the moment and will continue to play out are political risks. So the forthcoming UK referendum on its EU membership on the 23rd of June, and also just the general rise in populist parties both in the Eurozone and in the US. What does all that mean for growth? Well, it's likely that following sort of trend growth in the developed world, weaker growth in emerging markets towards the end of the year, we'll see a bit of a dent to growth everywhere in the first half of the year before things start to improve as some of those political risks pass and things pick up in the second half of the year.
Okay, and lastly, the Panama paper leaks have caused the Icelandic Prime Minister to resign, as well as the UK Prime Minister to admit to having financially benefited from an offshore investment fund, all in the space of a few days. Are we likely to see a telling economic impact from the ongoing saga?
Directly, probably not, but we may see there's a small probability of some secondary effects. And let's think about why. So populist parties, populist politics is on the rise in both Europe and in the US. And these Panama leaks might feed this fire somewhat. So the fringe parties like to attack the central parties on basically anything they can. So if there's material in these leaks that can discredit sort of central politicians, and they run most of the West and most of Europe, such as David Cameron, that's a perfect example, then the growing risk that exists because of populist parties and the fact that if they can use this to gain more ground, then that of course may have some secondary economic impacts. I think about why. Well, populist parties make it difficult to get things like supply-side reforms through. They generally cause political frictions, which can be damaging for markets. So growing risks from populism can suppress economic growth. So what we might find from this Panama leak, if it's used in the right way or the wrong way, depending on which way you look at it, by populist parties, then it may have some secondary, albeit modest, economic effects. But I think that that risk is quite low. I think that this will pass on the radar.
Thank you, Kallum. Be sure to check back on Monday for the week ahead with me, Sam Meredith. Have a great weekend and see you then.